live?
All right, folks. Well, no, I don't know if anyone's here or not, but we are. We're back. We've moved very close to one of the buildings now, so that we have Wi-Fi. Because I lost a signal.
Picture is so clear. Thank you, Wi-Fi.
Yeah, that's great.
Some time to look at tree rings.
Yeah. The funny thing about this is that it shows me 0 viewers, but obviously there are some, so I don't know quite what to make of that.
Can people hear him?
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Do you want me to sign in?
Sure.
Well, people are saying.
Okay, we've got 10 now.
Yeah,
It just went
people
from
are
0 to
saying
10.
pluses to like we are live, so I think
Great.
we're there. So I would say let's take it away.
Yeah.
Lane.
And Lane, I think it's going to be best for me to stay right here. Yeah.
I'll come closer to you.
Awesome.
All right, so we were just at a fire-scarred red pine that's living, and because of IT issues or technical difficulties, we're over in a different part of the same stand. And fortunately, we have this mobile prop.
Mobile device, right?
With us. So this is a cross-section of a red pine that was harvested in the 2016 harvest that Kyle was talking about. And it records a number of fire events that shows up on the bases of the living trees that are still in the stand. And these are the types of tree ring records that are my bread and butter, but I think these are like biocultural records that show up in the trees that are invaluable for informing how we do the ecological management of our fire-dependent systems. And so we were talking about the number of fire scars on a red pine that was over there, showing up as 4 fires. This particular cross-section has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fire years. You can see here that we have the university management era. So from 2016 or 2015 to 1910, we have a large fire-free interval. And then as you move farther back in time, we have a fire in 1909, another one in 1879, another in 1855, 1841, 1829, 1813. And this particular tree, because of the height that it was sampled at, we know it established in the 1790s or late 1780s. And the first fire that occurred, or at least scarred this tree, was 20 years after the tree started growing on the site. So the fire scar record shows just generally the importance of fire in the development of the stand, and what university management decision making, I guess the
difference of approach.
The difference in approach of having fire excluded from the site. But we can pull a lot of information related to fire frequency, obviously from these scars, but also fire seasonality. We can infer fire severity, and then we can get at spatial extent of fire, and also kind of fire climate relationships when we look at not just individual trees, but networks or groups of samples taken from across multiple sites. And so generally speaking, this type of record just suggests that fire could be an important part in maintaining these systems moving forward, and that fire reintroduction would be a way for us to kind of redirect these sites towards more of their historical condition. But we can also use the fire record to inform kind of the amount of mechanical sand maintenance we do, and kind of the intervals that we do that at, basically trying to mimic some of the effects fire might have had structurally using mechanical methods like brushing, mastication, things like that. So we have historical records from university staff that talk about the source of a lot of these ignitions, at least over the modern era, so from 1910 to about 1930. And there's no mention of lightning starts. There's mention of railroads and picnickers and logging slash fires and blueberry pickers. And so when we look at these historical records of fire and we compare that to kind of rates of ignition that we see over the present day, we're inferring that a lot of these starts are related to the human history or the use of this landscape by the Fond du Lac band and other indigenous peoples prior to university acquisition. And so a lot of what we're thinking about locally is ways to be doing fire stewardship, fire management that is respectful of the Fond du Lac band and their history on the land, and looking for ways to be partnering and working with them on site to kind of reincorporate some of their traditional practices with fire into the kind of stewardship we do here, both for education demonstration purposes, but also for new research opportunities and opportunities for community conversation.
Lane, maybe on that timing of fire, and when did fires burn?
As far as seasonality?
Yes, seasonality.
Yeah. So coming back to the tree ring record themselves, when we process these cross sections and get a really fine surface on them, and we look at the scars under magnification, we're able to assign seasonality to an individual fire year. So we might say, okay, this fire occurred in 1813, but then under magnification, we can look at the placement within that annual ring, and we can say that occurred prior to wood formation in the year 1813. So around here, we would infer that that's a dormant season fire, which could be in the fall, but with how we see fires occurring in this landscape present day, it's more likely like April to early June. And so I would say the vast majority of the fire scars that show up in our tree ring records here are considered to be dormant season, which we say is that spring window prior to wood formation during a given year. But we do have cases like in 1894 where we know in the historical record that a large landscape scale fire burned throughout lots of northern Minnesota in the fall, and that's reflected in the tree ring record as an 1894 late wood fire or a fall event. And then in other cases we have what we call early wood fire events. So they're showing up midsummer, falling like right in the middle of the annual ring. And so yeah, looking at a number of different trees, looking at very carefully at the placement of the scars, we can begin to like better understand the seasonality and how that relates to dry years or wetter years, and also potentially the sources of ignition. And of course that can be directly applied to how we think about reintroducing fire to these sites in the present day. Probably the application of any fire, if you're trying to reintroduce fire to stand, is better than nothing at all. But we know that fires that are occurring more in the growing season have better potential to impact and knock back hardwoods that we might be trying to reduce. That brushy layer that can inhibit regeneration or reduce the productivity of other ground flora.
And we're targeting pyrogenic flora like sweet fern and blueberry and wintergreen and other things that we still see in these systems, but because of that thick hazel layer, we see them at lower population densities than we think is how these systems would have historically been turned over. So that's part of the reason that's one thing that we can't mimic through through just the mechanical structural modification, is that favoring of pyrogenic species. And so that's trying to think about the whole community rather than just the trees. And that's been a big shift for me as a forester, because I feel like I'm trained to think about the trees. When I think forest health, I'm thinking about tree sickness actually. And when I think about, but what I'm trying to shift my mind around is thinking about how the whole system works. And that, I think then, as I come better aware of what I'm seeing in that understory layer, that to me is an important factor in thinking about system health and system processing.
Awesome. And maybe one more question while we have both of you within streaming locations. Thinking about prep work and what has to happen before a fire, and then also any concerns about accumulations around some of the trees when fires do burn.
Lane's been thinking about this a lot, so I'll have him talk about it.
Yeah, so for us, the amount of time that these sites have gone without fire, it makes a lot of sense for us to be doing mechanical treatments prior to any type of broadcast burning. And so all the sites where we're looking to reintroduce fire, they've been harvested within the last 10 years. And then in some cases we need to go in and do mechanical brushing to kind of open things up and reduce shading and make the fine fuels more available to burn in windows where we know we can get prescribed fire on the site safely and when personnel are available. Because of 100+ years of fuel accumulation, a lot of these overstory trees that have fire scars at the bases have a lot of litter and duff accumulated at the ground level, and some of that's from like bark slough and things like that. And when you have fire historically that was burning through every 15, 10 years, like that was not accumulating. And what we're doing in areas where we're trying to protect or reduce the mortality of fire scarred overstory red and white pine, we're pulling back the litter by hand using rakes about 1 meter or 1 yard on all sides of our fire scarred pine, with the idea that we're not going down mineral soil and potentially damaging any advantageous roots that are present in the duff layer, but we're able to pull back a lot of the fine fuels that are most likely to ignite and make it difficult to put out a fire that would become started within the cavity of a fire scarred pine, and also a way to just prevent potential heat kill of the living tissue on the back sides of these fire scarred trees. So that's an attempt for us to mitigate mortality in these stands where we have long-lived fire scarred trees, and we're also like kind of changing our tolerance for the amount of mortality we can get in some of our sites depending on our goals and objectives. And so some cases we are just preparing to lose a few more trees because there are trade-offs for when you are using fire as a tool in these sites. And yeah, after 200 years, some of them just don't have the same vigor that we would like them to have, and we have to be comfortable with that. Anything else, Marcella?
Yeah, let's talk about burn blocks, and as you're thinking about like what this looks within kind of CFC landscape, how are you moving through that, and maybe even talking about how this is a really exciting start to some of this conversation.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit on the broader scale. So luckily Lane's come in with some fire expertise and has really worked through some of the details. And for me, not having as much of a history in fire, my silviculture goal is I know that these systems need fire if we want them to be fire dependent systems moving into the future. So I need to then shift my expectations, saying some of these stands need fire. So then the question comes, okay, how can we do that, and where should we do it? Because we don't want to do it everywhere, because we know it creates issues with it likely creates issues with merchantability, in future merchantability of these stands. But we also think that it could potentially increase merchantability in the future because we're willing to use that process that is a part of these ecological systems. And so what I think Lane did a really good job of is saying, okay, we know we don't want to do fire everywhere. Can we find blocks and create blocks that could be reasonable to do and that could be reasonable to burn as first entries, and then create that into a larger fire block? So at this point we have 4 primary burn units. One of them is this unit here that we're in, which is actually only I think 2.5 acre unit, so really small, really economically doesn't make sense because our resources per acre are going to be just kind of out of whack. But we know that's important for then where we have our 30 and 40 acre burn units, we know it's important to kind of prep people for what they might see once they get into those larger burn units. And we know it's a way to reduce fuels over the long term right around our buildings here. So inevitably we'll have, I think it's a couple hundred acres as potential burnable acres, and they're all blocked basically right next to each other, so that then they start to form fire breaks. They start to work together on the landscape to create that kind of larger scale fire breaks. And we're gaining on our, we've had to put in perimeters, fire perimeters on these units because they didn't necessarily have them. We do have a really good road network, so we're taking advantage of that where possible. But what we're thinking is now these burn units, kind of 30 to 40 acre burn units, can start to work together over time and potentially light off the whole couple hundred acres at some point. I think that's low likelihood. But anything to add, Lane?
Yeah, just trying to keep a lot of our prescribed fire treatments adjacent to one another, so we can utilize breaks for multiple units in cases where a road runs through 2 stands or 2 prescribed fire units. We're trying to utilize kind of lowlands as natural breaks and putting fire line right at that forest margin to kind of use that as a potential way to avoid fire spreading outside the units. Not leaning on that entirely, but it just makes sense to try and use those natural breaks where possible. And then, yeah, the idea is to eventually have a large area of fire maintained habitat where people can be immersed in that sort of setting and experience how different that is from a lot of our other pine sites across northern Minnesota and the Great Lakes.
So Marcella said that there's a question about collaboration, and that's been a huge part of, so I started with this idea 5 years ago. I want to have fire on the landscape, and we basically still haven't gotten fire on the landscape, but we've been working through the details, and we know that collaboration is a really big part, because we have myself, Lane, and one other person, Rachel, as our forest management research staff. So we really don't have the resources to do fire ourselves, to do it safely. And Minnesota has some of the toughest liability laws in the nation, so we have to be really aware of that. And we want to make sure we're doing it in a way that isn't just getting black on the ground, but it's meeting our ecological objectives too. So we've been looking for partners. Ideally, we partner with the tribe, but there's been some challenges there, just because we don't have an official working relationship with the band, so they can't necessarily lead fires here because that means that they're taking on that liability, and that's been a big issue. So even as we know that's an important partnership for the longer term, because it's not up to us to make these burns culturally important. That would be something that they would run with if they want to, but it's important for us to collaborate with them and have true collaboration, so that then there is that potential opportunity for it to not only be ecologically significant, but potentially culturally significant as well. So we're still working on how to get that collaboration going, and that it seems like we're going to be able to do it, hopefully, with they've requested from the BIA to be able to have resources directed to do the fire. So tying it into the BIA burn program seems like a way that will help us to be able to actually have a true collaboration with Fond du Lac when we're doing these burns. In the short term, we've found partnerships. Lane has worked really hard to find those partnerships, and the partnerships have been with the Forest Stewards Guild and the Nature Conservancy. So the Forest Stewards Guild has been trying to increase their the presence of prescribed burning in the Great Lakes region, and had access to some funds that helped us to get a majority of this prep work done. So that raking treatment happened in a 20-acre burn unit and had about 1,100 trees that needed to get raked. And so through the funding that we got with, in partnership with Forest Stewards Guild, we were able to create a contract to get that done. So that partnership's been huge. The other really big important partnership has been the Nature Conservancy. They also, I think nationwide, have in their goals to increase the use of prescribed fire on the landscape in order to prevent the mega fires that we're seeing all over the place. Not that it's going to fully prevent that, but in order to try and use fire because of its ecological and cultural significance. So they're looking for ways to partner on they're not a major landowner in Minnesota, but they do a lot of collaborative management. And they have a RXB2 burn boss, so qualified burn boss. We knew that if we wanted to burn here, we'd have to work with somebody that is that has the certification, the National Wildland NWCG, National Wildland Coordinating Group certifications, if we wanted to go up to muster. So we're still working on that collaboration with TNC. So we're a little bit at the whim of the weather and of their resources and other potential collaborators that we can pull in.
We're practicing patience, but we're getting closer. and we're feeling good about the partnerships that we've developed, and long term, we're setting ourselves up for some success.
And the I'm not sure if you all know about Trek's training exchanges, prescribed fire training exchanges, but that was the avenue that we thought we were going to get these burns going, restart this burn program, or start it for the first time for us in spring 2020 through the training exchange that the Nature Conservancy was leading, and then COVID happened. And so we got pushed back a little bit, but the training exchange allows agencies to do collaborative burning. So I think it's basically a mobile burn crew of about 40 people, and they give or take
depending on the treks.
Depending on the treks. So we think that's a good opportunity to get fire done here. We could go out and pay a contractor potentially, and we might have to resort to that for these first burns, but. We'd rather work with people that want to work with us to meet the variety of objectives that we have. And doing it through a Trex would give opportunities to others to learn through the process of what does it take to get fire into a stand that hasn't seen meaningful fire in over 100 years. And not that everybody has that on their land base, but I think there are a lot of interesting things to consider when we're doing fire here. So we're trying to make it an educational opportunity as well.
I have us coming up on the hour.
Yep,
So
11:58.
maybe any last words from Kyle and Lane before we say thank you and sign off? Any last words you want to leave NASP15 with?
I think the main lesson I've learned as I've gotten to do on-the-ground training, or on-the-ground prescriptions, that I was reminded of in talking about this stand, is we can't do everything everywhere. So we're prioritizing fuel reduction and potential prescribed burn in this. We're prioritizing timber production elsewhere. We're prioritizing reserve stands elsewhere. So I think that lesson of we can't do everything everywhere has been really important for me to learn as I start to be a practicing forester.
I guess I'll say, if you're responsible for managing fire-dependent forests anywhere in the country, you are a forest manager, you're also a fire manager by default. And hopefully some of the information we shared today can help you think about some of the possibilities for the management you do, and opportunities for collaboration and working across disciplines within your own home offices.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. This has been fun. I hope you've enjoyed the tour. We've enjoyed taking you out here. Thanks for your patience with the live stream and tuning back in.
Oh, and remember, so this is your time now to work. If there is anyone not in NASP watching this, this no longer applies to anything. You're like, great, thanks for joining, and maybe send Eli an email if you somehow stumbled upon this, if you're not from NASP. But like, if you are in NASP, this is now your time to work on those presentations. So you have your climate presentation that should be a total of about an hour working together. And make sure you have that slide ready tomorrow for Linda, Courtney, and Maria. You also have your critique presentation. Please remember, those are due and uploaded 7:45 a.m. Central Standard Time tomorrow, Thursday, August 5th. Making sure I got date and day correct there. So, but please take that time. We'll be available through email, but we're going to now transition from Wi-Fi outside to maybe Wi-Fi around buildings and also grab some lunch.
Yeah.
So thank you all, and yeah.
All right. See you tomorrow.